We are continuing in a series. We took a little bit of a break from it last Sunday because of Mother's Day, but we are continuing in a series looking at the life of Joseph. And this morning we're talking about the fact that there are some times that we lose our ground. We sometimes wonder why life seems to allow us to take one step forward and then what? 2 steps back? Or maybe 2 steps forward and 5 steps back? And we get frustrated. We think we're making some advancement. We think things are getting better, and then something just clobbers us and lays us flat, and we lose ground. How do we deal with that? Well, this is the 4th in our series on tough questions when easy answers don't cut it. And we all have to deal with those tough questions. And giving just the regular run-of-the-mill answer, oh, God will take care of you, or you can handle it. It just doesn't cut us because sometimes we are just laid flat. And I want us to pick up where we left off in Joseph's story just a couple weeks ago. We know that Joseph was sold into slavery by his 10 jealous brothers. We know that he was then a servant in Potiphar's house and then was thrown into prison when Potiphar's wife wrongly accused him of making moves on her, of trying to seduce her. And while in prison, he was interpreting dreams. And he interpreted the dream of the Pharaoh's cupbearer, his butler, his wine taster. And he said that you will be returned to Pharaoh's household. But when you do, remember me. Well, Pharaoh's butler did not remember him until Pharaoh, 2 years later, had some dreams that no one could interpret. And we see that Joseph was remembered at that time. He was called up from the prison. He bathed, he shaved, he made himself presentable to the king of Egypt, and he correctly interpreted the dreams and then offered the right suggestion to solve the problems in the dreams. And from the morning to the evening, Joseph went from being a prisoner to being the governor of Egypt, being the second in command next to Pharaoh. So sometimes things can overwhelm you. Well, what happened after that? What about Joseph's situation with his brothers who decades before had really done him wrong? Here's where the story picks up. Genesis chapter 42, in verses 6 through 10, the famine had taken effect on the whole region, and Egypt alone was the only place that had grain because of Joseph's efforts to save the grain and to build great storage bins to be able to make sure there was enough not only for Egypt but for the neighboring countries. It made Egypt a very wealthy land. And one of the neighboring countries was Canaan, where Joseph was from and where Joseph's brothers and his father still lived. And so the story picks up in Genesis chapter 42, starting at verse 10, and I'll be reading through starting at verse 6, I'll be reading through verse 10. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the one who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Do you remember his dream? I dreamt, when he was 17 years old, I dreamt that we were in the field and we all had sheaves of grain and your sheaves bowed down to mine. Yeah, the dreamer. They hated him for that. But now it happened. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. Well, from the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Now remember, decades had passed. Remember, their young brother was a kid. Remember that he didn't look anything like a Jew now because he was dressed as the governor of Egypt. And so they did not recognize him. Verse 9, then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. No, my lord, they answered. Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies. And so these 10 who were guilty of selling him into slavery come to him to buy grain for survival. Well, Joseph decided to test them. He didn't look like them. He didn't act like them. He was speaking Egyptian instead of Hebrew. And so the test comes in verses 21 through 25. It says, "They said to one another, 'Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. And that's why this distress has come upon us.'" Now let me fill in a little bit of a gap there. Joseph said to them, "All of you but one are going to be thrown into prison until you bring back that younger brother as proof that you're not spies." And then he turned it around and he said, "All of you but one will be freed, but I'm going to keep Simeon. He is going to be thrown into prison. You need to bring back your younger brother, so I know your story's real." And they said, "Hey, it's because of what we did to Joseph." They were remorseful. Verse 22, Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an account for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then turned back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in its sack, and to give them provisions for the journey. And after this was done, they loaded the grain on their donkeys and left. So here's Reuben reprimanding the other 9. If you remember the story, it was Reuben who wanted to secretly come back after Joseph was thrown into that dry cistern and save him. And when Reuben got there, he had already been sold to the traders, and already was on his way to Egypt. And so it was Reuben who scolded the rest of his brothers. "You see what you did? You know I wasn't in on this. And now we're all paying the penalty." So the test came decades after the event. In chapter 43, starting at verse 26, Joseph had them come back. They came back for one simple reason. They were accused of keeping their money, and they returned. And this time they returned with their younger brother. And so we see this in verses 26 through 33 of chapter 43. This is their second trip back to Egypt. They're told when Joseph came home, he presented to him the gifts they had brought from their house, and they bowed down before him to the ground. Here again, the 10 sheaves bowing to the one. He asked them how they were, and then they said, "How is your aged father you told me about? Is he still living?" They replied, "Your servant our father is still alive and well." And then they bowed low to pay him honor. Third time, bowing down to him. And as he looked about, he saw his brother Benjamin, his own mother's son. He asked, "Is this your youngest brother, the one you told us about?" Now remember, Joseph was 17. Benjamin was just a little boy. And he would not have recognized him now as a young adult. And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Deeply moved by the sight of his brother, Joseph hurried out and looked for a place to weep. He went into his private room and he wept there. You have these guys bowing down 3 times and keep tally. Now Joseph is crying twice. Verse 31, and after he had washed his face, he came out and controlling himself said, "Serve the food." And they served him by himself, the brothers by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with them by themselves, because Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that is detestable to Egyptians. It's interesting that Joseph was a Hebrew, and even some of the Egyptians probably were not aware of it by that time. Verse 33, the men had been seated before him in the order of their ages, from the firstborn to the youngest, and they looked at each other in astonishment. How did Joseph know? They didn't know it was Joseph. How did the governor know this? How could he tell who was the younger and who was the older? And then when the meal was served, Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as anyone else's. And they wondered about that too. Well, they left on good terms, but Joseph had one more test for them. He took the silver chalice, the cup he had been drinking from, the one they would recognize was the governor's cup. And he said, hide it in the youngest brother's sack. And they did. And then Joseph sent a posse out after them. You have stolen the governor's cup. And so we have it picking up again in chapter 44. Now in verse 10, it says, back up here and find it. It says, very well then, let it be as you say. Whoever is found to have it will become my slave, and the rest of you will be free from blame. And so each of them quickly lowered their sack to the ground, and they opened it. And then the steward proceeded to search, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest. And the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. And at this they tore their clothes, and they loaded their donkeys, and they returned to the city. They tore their clothes in grief, because now what were they going to do? Benjamin might die because the cup was found in his sack. And then finally in chapter 45, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Look at verses 1 through 5. Joseph could no longer control himself before his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. And so there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Third time for crying. This time, he's not hiding it. This time he is overcome with emotion. Verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. This is the governor who could kill us all. Verse 4, then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said again, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there have been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be any plowing or reaping, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So here's where we're at. It's time for justice. And how does Joseph handle it? When we experience betrayal, we have a choice. We can choose to be bitter, judgmental, or resentful. Or we can choose to find a place of forgiveness. And when we're dealing with losing our ground, we gain our ground by forgiving, folks. So there's two things about forgiveness we want to talk about real quickly. First of all, why we forgive, why we need to forgive. 2 reasons we need to forgive. First, it's important for our own health and for our own welfare to forgive. I'm going to tell you something you probably already know. Bitterness tears us up from the inside out. When we are upset, when we are angry, it could be that the person we are angry at has no idea that they're on the bad side of our hearts. But inside, it's just scratching at the inside. Someone once said bitterness is like an acid. It does more damage to the container in which it is stored than on the object upon which it is poured. Isn't that true? If we don't let go of bitterness, if we don't forgive, we die on the inside. But secondly, it's important to forgive because we have been forgiven much. Would you do something with me? Would you recite the Lord's Prayer with me? I don't want us to bow our heads and pray the Lord's Prayer. I want us to say this is a scripture. It's a teaching on prayer from Jesus. So out loud, together, I just want us to recite the words. Okay? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. How many know that? You know it by heart, don't you? You've heard it so many times. And all those things that Jesus told us to pray about, do you realize there was only one thing he went back to after the prayer was prayed? He went to the issue of forgiveness. And he said, God will only forgive you with the measure you forgive others. And if you don't forgive others, God cannot forgive you. Oh my, that could put some of us in a real predicament. If we're still harboring bitterness towards someone else, if there's something in our hearts that prevents us from coming submissively before God to receive his forgiveness, then we can't be forgiven. The Apostle John wrote this. John said, if you say, I love God, and you hate your brother, you are a liar. If we're unwilling to forgive others their sins against us, how can we have the right heart and attitude for God to forgive us? Jesus told the parable of an unforgiving servant. Do you remember the story? A man of great wealth and prestige had servants. One servant owed him a bunch of money, probably more than he could pay off in a lifetime. And he was about to throw him into prison. And the servant begged for mercy. He said, please let me pay this off. Don't throw me into prison. Don't enslave my family. And the one who was owed much said, very well. And he forgave the debt. He forgave it. Well, this guy went out, and he saw one of the other servants of the man who owed him a little bit of money. And he took him, and he shook him, and he says, you pay me what you owe right now, or you go to jail. And the guy said the same thing. Give me time. Let me pay it. Don't throw me in prison. And that servant said, forget it, guy. And he wound up in prison. The other servants were incensed by what they just saw because they knew what their master had done in his grace. They reported it to their master, and the one who could not forgive one of his fellows had his forgiveness taken away from him himself. And he was in prison until he paid the last penny. Refusing to forgive is a sign that we do not realize what God's done for us. Can you think about that? If there's someone that is unforgiven in our lives, if there is someone that is causing us to be eaten up from the inside out, what it's saying is we don't really appreciate what God's done for us. We need to forgive. Well, secondly, Joseph teaches us how to gain back our ground. Yes, we go a few steps back. How do we move forward again? Keep in mind those people we need to forgive when it comes to gaining our ground. And there's 5 quick things. First, take time. Small offenses can be forgiven quickly, but when we're dealing with serious matters, we may need to take some time. Joseph took his time to be sure that his brothers were genuine, and they weren't just trying to pull some con game on him and be sweet to him and be kind and be respectful because they were dealing with the governor of Egypt. He wanted to see that it was real. And so take time, get advice. Be sure that things are reconciled in the right way so that you don't fall back into your old ways and you don't find out that in your heart and in the heart of the one you're forgiving that there hasn't been some real differences. Secondly, do not misplace blame. Don't take the blame for yourself if someone really was at fault. And likewise, don't blame everyone else if you're at fault. Do not misplace blame. Here's what Joseph said when he revealed himself to his brothers. He said, you meant what you did for me for evil, but God meant it for good. Bragging to his brothers in a dream is not in the same camp as being sold into slavery. You realize there's different levels of wrongs? And yes, Joseph wasn't a perfect man, but his braggery didn't compare to the lies and the treachery of his brothers. Third, we need to grieve. And that's what Joseph did. That's why we see all the tears in this story. He had to grieve. Grief is a part of the forgiveness process. We need to consider these times that Joseph cried and realize that when we grieve over the things that have happened in our lives, it does 2 things. It relieves the burden but it also relieves the sadness at the same time. When we forgive someone, we recognize what was lost, and we're accepting the pain. We give up on retaliating. We give up on getting even or on hurting the person who hurt us. Fourth, we need to seek to reconcile relationships. And I'll tell you, some relationships are not easily reconciled. Some bridges are burned so badly we can't rebuild them. But real forgiveness means you make the effort. You make the effort to reestablish the relationship. The relationship may never, ever be the same. And in Joseph's case, he did not immediately reestablish trust. He had to test them. Trust has to be earned. And there's times that we can forgive someone, but we can't go back to the old relationship because we may be burned again. Rebuilding relationships is something that God can do. We can forgive, but we need to be smart enough to know when we should not go back. Fifth, we need to bless those who wound you. Jesus said that. Bless those who persecute you. Bless them. Don't persecute them. And here we see Joseph refusing to retaliate. The most basic definition of forgiveness is giving up my right to get even. You want to jot that one down? The most basic definition of forgiveness, giving up my right to get even. And Joseph always gave his brothers more than they deserved. He gave them the grain that they purchased. He put their money back into the sacks, and he did that before he ever revealed himself as their brother. This is the real test of forgiveness. Can you do something kind to the one who has wounded you? Well, for one thing, can you pray for them? I've been told over the years it's hard to stay mad at someone if you're genuinely praying for them. And it is. Joseph kept his promise. In chapter 50, verses 17 through 21, he was faithful to them as family. We see that Jacob had died, and the brothers now, after having lived in Egypt for a number of years, now seeing their dad gone, were concerned. Okay, dad's gone. Now is Joseph going to retaliate? Now is Joseph going to get even since dad's out of the picture? And they came to him and told him what Jacob had said. He said, I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they've committed in treating you so badly. And when Joseph heard their message, guess what he did? He didn't say, no way, Jose. You're going to serve time in prison as much as I did. No, it says he cried. He cried again. He wept again. And they came to him again and threw themselves at his feet and said, we're your slaves. Why? How many times is this dream going to come true? And Joseph said, don't be afraid. I am not in the place of God. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So don't be afraid. He was put there in spite of all the trouble he faced, ultimately for a blessing for his family. Bob Russell was heard saying this, I honestly don't hold a grudge against anyone. Now that's putting feet on the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us with the measure that we forgive others. And we need to ask God for forgiveness for ourselves. We need to consider the people we need to forgive every day. You know, you can forgive someone and never let them know because they don't know about the offense in the first place. Think about that. You can forgive them. And you can freshen your life. God wants us to forgive everybody who has wounded us. And for some, the next step might be competent counseling. Maybe the wound is so deep, you're going to need some help. You're going to need someone to guide you through this. But for most of us, this thought of forgiveness is the next step to intentionally, purposefully forgive and to start the healing process. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24 says, by his wounds you have been healed. He has forgiven us. And shouldn't we use that measure to forgive others? God wants us to forgive ourselves. That's the toughest one to forgive. We might be able to forgive everyone else in the world, but we're still kicking ourselves in the seat of the pants. And we're still hating ourselves, and we're despising ourselves. Here's the problem. If we cannot forgive ourselves, then we're saying, God, I don't believe that you've forgiven me. I don't think you can forgive me for what I've done. Don't leave out yourself as a person to forgive, but forgive as Christ has forgiven you. Accept Jesus' grace and forgive not just others, but yourself. And live. Regain your lost ground. Let God make that difference as you surrender yourself to him. This morning we want to give you the chance to make that kind of commitment to Jesus Christ. Now there's some of you here who we're all at different levels in our faith. And there's some here who maybe are even struggling with the believing the reality of who Jesus is. But there's others that have accepted that reality, but you've never obeyed him in baptism. And there's some of us who have been lifelong Christians, and we've kind of gone the wrong way. We've been taking our steps backwards. I don't do the moonwalk, by the way. But we need to start walking forward. We need to start stepping toward the cross. And we need to do that with open arms of forgiveness to the people who have hurt us here. Forgive us our trespasses with the measure we forgive those who trespass against us. Are you ready to do that? Wherever you are today, whatever your need is today, if you need to come forward and make a commitment to Christ and ask for prayer, you can do that today as we stand and as we sing this song together. Let's stand.